weather was none too good. With the little ships plugged on
In the
deck,
summer of 1944, during the height of World War II, the US and its allies were about to make history and conduct one of the most daring military operations the world had ever seen, transporting hundreds of thousands of troops, vehicles, and supplies across the English Channel and into France. So how did these military planners pick where to land? Well, it stems down to three big things: terrain, proximity to critical infrastructure, and while not as important, the beach ideally is also near a major city for strategic and symbolic purposes. This is important now because almost 80 years later, Taiwan faces a similar situation, with China threatening to bring it under its control. So now, Taiwan needs to pinpoint where exactly China could land to prevent a possible invasion. When talking about a beach invasion, there's the question of when, where, and how. Well, today we're going to be talking about the when and the where. We'll discuss how a beach landing and a broader invasion would be carried out in our next video. If you want more, make sure to leave a comment and like so that we know that you're interested. We can't ignore the fact that weather has a huge effect on military operations. It can influence how the military decides to act. Famously, in 1944, the Allies were supposed to launch the invasion on June 5th. But meteorologists predicted bad weather, so they moved it to 24 hours later. It wasn't until a small pocket of good weather was identified, and that's when the operation started. But that was in the English Channel, and the Taiwan Strait is much different. A heavy monsoon and typhoon season in the summer, and sporadic windows of rain and wind in the winter make conditions brutal in the strait, even for regular travel. And China knows this.
There are really only fairly narrow windows for when an invasion could be successfully launched. And this is for a number of reasons, right? One, that the worse the weather, especially if you're trying to, in a typhoon, the less ability for planes to operate, for example. And air superiority, we know, is extremely important in war generally, but especially in an amphibious invasion. If you cannot control the skies, your ships and other forces will get picked off.
This leaves only 2 times during the year where the risk of transporting troops is relatively low. One is between April and May, and the other is during October and November. So now that we've narrowed down the most likely windows, now we have to look at what the crossing would look like in general in terms of geography. During the D-Day landing, the Allies were looking to cross about 150 kilometers on average. That's actually roughly the same distance that China would have to travel in order to reach the mainland of Taiwan. And if you thought weather was an obstacle, Taiwan's terrain poses a much bigger challenge.
Well, the island of Taiwan, the main island, is literally one of the worst places you can possibly imagine trying to invade. Very rough conditions in the water itself, obviously a lot of fog as well. Then as you're approaching the beaches, it gets very, very shallow. The beaches themselves are pretty small, very rocky.
Taiwan has long been considered a natural fortress, with cliffs on the east coast, a central mountain system splitting the country in half, and relentless sea conditions on the west coast. Now imagine trying to transport hundreds of thousands of troops. That's why terrain is so important.
And the United States military itself thought it was very difficult back in 1944 after Normandy, when it was planning to, of course, invade Formosa and develop plans to do so, that called for double the number that it used in Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy on D-Day. So this was very, very difficult for the United States military in 1944, 81 years ago. It is infinitely more difficult since then with the capabilities that have been developed.
Over the past few decades, Taiwanese military planners have scanned the entire coastline of Taiwan for vulnerabilities. In fact, in 2017, it was made public that every year, Taiwan's Marines do a thorough walkthrough of the coastline and label each section of the beach with one of 3 colors: blue, yellow, and red. Blue beaches are areas that would be difficult to invade, usually due to terrain. So that means that the beach is either too rocky, too muddy, or maybe there's no beach at all. Yellow beaches could be suitable to land and might have great terrain, but these parts of the beach might be too small to support the scale of operations needed, so all of the troops and equipment in a full-scale invasion. But that wouldn't stop smaller landings from happening simultaneously as the main invasion, so Taiwan's military still labels yellow beaches as vulnerable. Now, the most vulnerable and the most likely spots for China to land, according to Taiwan's military, are labeled as red beaches. These areas are crucial for an amphibious invasion. This part of the coast has favorable terrain, it's close to critical infrastructure like a runway or a port, and it's also next to a populated city that the enemy could occupy. While the total number could change based on Taiwan's own assessment, we learned that there are an estimated 14 red beaches across the main island, and the majority sit on the west coast facing China. The east coast of Taiwan does have a few beaches available, but many of them are rocky, and that would also mean trying to wrap around the country and landing further away.
红色沙滩其实是这样子，就是在地理上它比较适合登陆。
To understand more, we meet up with Dr. Tzu-yun. He's the Director of Military Strategy and Resources at the Institute for National Defense and Security Research, a government-backed think tank. They're the main research center that helps suggest security policies and gives recommendations on how to handle Taiwan's biggest military threats. He spent decades understanding Taiwan's security situation. Experts don't see a main landing on the East Coast as a likely scenario. Instead, Su highlights what he thinks are the 3 most likely red beaches.
但是里面最重要的是3个，一个就是在台北附近的巴黎这里的红色沙滩，因为靠近台北港，还有桃园机场，还有在台中这里的甲南沙滩，它登陆之后也可以占领台中港，还有这个就清泉岗空那个机场。第3个就是在台南这里的黄金海岸，它也是靠近台南港，还有台南机场。所以这3个可能是最重要的。
While all 3 of these are red beaches, some are more suitable than others. Let's take a look at each beach using the 3 conditions that we talked about. First, we'll look at Jianan Beach in Taichung, which is in central Taiwan, and we'll focus on the terrain.
With about 3 kilometers of open beach that's not too rocky, it's not too sandy, this is the perfect texture for Chinese landing craft to come up on the shore. That's why it's no surprise that this area is a bit of a concern for Taiwan's military.
This area is one of the flattest parts of the coastline in central Taiwan, which is great for landing vehicles. However, that's not the case just a few minutes down the coast.
You take a 10-minute walk off the beach, that sort of sandy area turns into this wetland, and I'm taking my shoes off because this is actually a very popular tourist destination here in Taiwan, with many people coming to Jaime wetlands to take photos of the wind farms in the background.
This marshy and unstable terrain is a natural obstacle for landing troops, or even to walk across it. But if you go south again, you hit a wall. Now this wall is built here as a perimeter for the wind farm to protect it from any waves. Past the wind farm, you get a port, and that would have been ideal if not for these concrete walls. And so because the wetlands and the wind farm break up the port and the flat sandy beaches, this puts this beach on the lower end of Taiwan's military worries, but it's still vulnerable.
所以不管是美国或是其他日本等等的兵推，有2个主要的，一个是从台中登陆，把台湾切成南北2段，那另外一个是说从南部登陆，那往北打。那合理的看，我们再看就是它只有一个叫做这个major force 会放在哪边，那可能就是以中南部为主。
Director Su says that farther south, near the city of Tainan, sits a much more appealing target. Xishu Beach hugs the coastline of southern Tainan and could be a main target as it comes with fewer risks than some beaches in the north.
我感觉可以选哪一个是比较重要的，还是北部的吗？
目前就是依照各国智库评估，它可能会从南部登陆。
OK，
因为北部这里有这个重兵，有非常多的部队防守，加上地形比较狭窄，所以他可能会选择比较多平原 plain 的地方登陆，那再往北边进攻。所以很可能就是台南这里会是它的那个最高优先 priority。
This area where Taiwan has held drills before is a prime example of what China is looking for in terms of critical infrastructure. Invading Xishu Beach is close to both a port and an airbase. In the heart of Tainan sits the port of Anping, which is an international trading hub and able to support large transport ships. And that's ideal for China, as it looks to utilize existing infrastructure to bring in more ships and offload troops and equipment much more easily. A few kilometers away sits Tainan Air Base, which also doubles as the city's local airport. This massive airfield, which spans over 3 kilometers wide, would be ideal for large transport planes and helicopters to offload more troops and supplies.
他如果说在这里建立第一个所谓的滩头堡，对他来讲最有利，就可以让后续的部队陆续的上来，这是选择台南的原因。那高雄的话就比较也可以，但是比较麻烦，因为港口跟机场距离比较远。
屏东呢，因为这个看起来是 maybe 可能比较适合，就是有 space 的话，但是屏东不是一个选择，是因为没有 infrastructure 嘛。
屏东它当然可以登陆，可是它如果登陆的话，它要从最南边往北边，而且容易受到地形的这个切割，效果比较有限。但是会有一个 symbol， 一个象征意义，就表示我登陆台湾了。
This concern about where a landing could occur in a possible invasion is shared by US and Taiwanese defense planners, who have spent years wargaming these conflict scenarios. When we traveled to Washington, D.C., we met with wargame analyst Mark Kansian from CSIS, who explained that in their simulations, they found similar findings.
Taiwan has most of its combat power up in the north by the capital, not surprisingly. What that drives the Chinese to do typically is that they will then land in the south where it's less defended. Here's an undefended beach down here.
Without another landing, China would have to make its way up the entire west coast in order to capture the center of power in Taipei. But there's a reason why the north is more fortified, and that brings us to our third and final condition of a red beach, which is that it carries a strategic and symbolic win. And for that, we go for a drive up north. We're on the way right now to the northern coastline of Taiwan, which is about a 30-minute drive from the center of the city to an area which is right next to 2 big red beaches, Haihu Beach and Linkou Beach. But because they're both near the district of Bali in Danshui, many locals just call it Bali Beach. Similar to Xishu Beach, the Bali area is close to an airfield, which is Tzu-yun International Airport, the country's largest. However, the biggest advantage over taking this target is a chance at a symbolic win.
Yeah, well, you have to remember what Xi Jinping wants, and everyone that studies him closely believe that he wants, just like Putin wanted and didn't succeed, obviously, a very quick operation, right? A week-long, couple-day operation to try to take the island, which requires a decapitation of the Taiwanese government, which means you need to get into the city of Taipei very quickly, try to immobilize the presidential palace, the Ministry of National Defense headquarters, all the other key government installations.
If China takes Taipei, Taiwan's central command would be gone, and analysts say defenses would be left scrambling. Now, the roads are not the only entryway to the city. There's also the Danshui estuary.
The opening to the Tanshui River that can lead you right into the heart of Taipei, of course. If they're going to use these LCAC boats with huge motors on them that can quickly go down this river, they're pretty low, so they can sort of go under the bridge that has been built across that river and be within the heart of the government district of Taipei in 10 to 15 minutes and offload hundreds of Marines that can then do an assault operation on those key government facilities.
All of the beaches we've talked about are no doubt red beaches, but each of these have their own strengths and weaknesses. Just like the invasion of Normandy, the Allies could have made the short trip of crossing the English Channel at the closest distance, but arguably that was the most guarded. And now China is looking at a similar decision, only this time at a much larger scale with more advanced weapons. But there is one new development, though, that is reshaping views on red beaches and landing in Taiwan. As China is trying to overcome some of the obstacles of Normandy, but also learn from modern warfare in both Ukraine and Gaza. New images show China building what many are describing as invasion barges. These are massive floating docks that can dig into the seabed and connect to form a large bridge. These could potentially turn yellow and maybe even blue beaches into red beaches and widen China's capability to transport troops. It's no secret that one of the biggest challenges for Beijing is having enough sea lift capability so being able to bring everything you need for an invasion. China has also invested heavily in civilian shipping too, and if you add these barges, this could change the calculus.
It does give China better capabilities to, one, move through bad weather environment, but also to reach over some of the non-red beaches, potentially, and land forces, kind of widening the number of beaches that China could potentially attack from.
But like any military operation, not everything will always go to plan. Even something as simple as a strong gust of wind could push ships and paratroopers in the wrong direction.
And so while picking the perfect spot is important, as well as having favorable weather, China still has to cross and go up against Taiwan's military. And if you remember what Dimitri said about trying to take the capital quickly, well, Taiwan knows this, and the military has spent decades practicing how to defend against this exact scenario. In the next video, we'll be looking at exactly how China would attack Taiwan's coast and what Taiwan would do to stop it. Hit that subscribe and bell icon to be notified of that video, as well as other videos about Taiwan.